In this exciting episode, it's a pint-sized client part 2, Season 2, Episode 8 of Perry Mason, The Case of the Jilted Jockey. Welcome to the Perry Pod. I'm your humble host, Jonathan Searcy, and my purpose here is pretty simple: provide an audio companion to the greatest legal drama in television history, Perry Mason. I plan to do a pod for every episode of the television series, and as time permits, I'll look at some of those made-for-TV movies too. I'll be working through the series in the order in which the episodes were aired. Each episode I'll give a brief refresher on the plot, and if the episode was based on a novel, I'll compare the book with its television adaptation. Next, I'll list some key pieces of trivia, as well as tackle the episode's main theme. We'll feature a Perry proverb, a moment of wisdom from the man himself, and then we'll finish with a post-case water cooler, where just like Perry, Della, and Paul, we can rehash the ins and outs of their adventures. But first, to the law library! Each episode in the law library, we return to prior cases to refresh our memory about Perry's past so we can find fresh precedents for future cases. Maybe it's because this show features divorces aplenty that Perry has to let his clients know that's really not his line of work.
If I don't throw the Pacific Derby on Saturday, she'll leave me.
Divorce? I don't handle divorce cases, Mr. Barton.
First, this shows Perry explicitly stating a position he implicitly took in Season 1, most notably in the case of the fan dancer's horse.
What kind of help?
She and her brother need the most important criminal lawyer in California. You, Mr. Mason. I haven't got much money, but I can...
I asked you what kind of help.
Protection from Calendar. And Lois has got to find that horse.
Why protection from Calendar?
Calendar is her husband. She just left him and...
Oh, I'm sorry.
I'm not asking you to handle a divorce case. This is blackmail.
Oh?
I love how Perry's ears perk up at the mention of blackmail. Huh? What's that you say? Blackmail? I'm in! Second, in this episode, The Case of the Jilted Jockey, Perry ends his meeting with Tick Barton by appearing to agree to take on Tick's case in a divorce trial. You listen and tell me what you think. As we find out at the end of the episode, the Barton marriage will be severed in court. I don't know if Perry's going to take up the case of the unrestrained writer. We never get to see that one. The general principle is you better come to Perry with more than a desire to call it quits on your spouse. Without further ado, let's get to the plot of this episode. The Case of the Jilted Jockey. Jockey Tick Barton has seen his share of bad luck. A spill on a horse knocked him out of several horse owners' good graces, and we see his wife basically throw herself at Val Kilmer lookalike chic cowboy Johnny Starr in the episode's second scene. Still, Tick seems to believe he's a lucky man. After all, he's the jockey for Bright Magic, a horse with a real shot to win the Pacific Derby.
I'm a lucky man, Mr. Allen.
Lucky? I think you've had more than your share of bad breaks lately.
I've got an owner who's proud to have me ride his horse in the Derby, a trainer who believes in me, and a wife who loves me.
Tick's announcement yields a massive eye roll from Bob Allen, the horse's trainer who actually got Tick hired. Now, we've seen Allen before, that is the actor who portrays Allen, when he was the judge in the case of the drowning duck. And in fact, we've got a host of recastables in this episode. Johnny Starr is Gary Marshall, the wannabe adulterous cowhand in the case of the desperate daughter. Calendar, who's the horse owner from the Case of the Fan Dancer's Horse, appears here named Banyan, another horse owner, and his wife, you might remember as the nightclub owner from the Case of the Hesitant Hostess. And Tick's wife, well, she was running around with the murder victim in the Case of the Half-Wakened Wife. Something tells me they're getting into typecasting here. Back to our story. Tick's wife having an affair with a low-level hoodlum, Johnny Starr, who wants Tick to throw the upcoming Pacific Derby. He gets Tick's wife to do the dirty work.
You want a divorce?
Yes.
Is there another guy, Gloria?
Of course there isn't. You know there isn't.
I kind of thought a few times lately.
Of course there's nobody else. I've told you all about it. I've tried to explain it to you. Oh, I'm sorry, Dick. You'll just have to make up your mind. Either you throw this race, or I'll get a divorce.
Tick is smart enough and honest enough to consult Perry, who takes the case. This precipitates some high-grade ticket trumping among Perry, Della, and Paul.
What seats do you have?
Section E.
It just so happens that I have 3 seats here, Section B.
Well, we'll use yours. They're better.
Hold it. We'll use mine. Box seats on the finish line.
You go, Paul! Bright Magic ends up losing the race, and everybody is upset. The owner, the trainers, and especially Tick.
If there was any business done, I think I know who handled it.
Of course, Johnny Starr ends up diggity dead, and Tick ends up blamed for it. The suspects for the crime include Tick's wife.
Are you thinking that Johnny Starr and I might have been in love? And that because he was married and didn't tell me, I might have had a reason to kill him?
Mightn't you?
Bright Magic's owner, Mr. Banyan.
How much was your bet, Mr. Banyan?
$2,000.
At 50 to 1, that's $100,000. Plus the purse, that's a lot of money to lose because someone doped your horse.
And Eddie Davis, the assistant trainer.
Now, tell the court, Mr. Davis, isn't it true that you did accept Starr's offer, that you did dope Bright Magic, that after the race you went to Starr's apartment to collect, that he tried to welch on paying off?
Ding, 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 ding! We have a winner. Now, earlier in the episode, Paul has shown remarkable facility at thinking like a horse race fixer.
Take out insurance.
Oh.
Hire somebody else. Get 2 people working independently. Have 2 chances to get the job done.
Eddie Davis was the other man Johnny Starr hired. Davis pulled off the doping, but then didn't get the cash he wanted from Starr and killed him. The damning evidence against Davis was his bank account. He had cashed $5,000 in blackmail money from Mr. Banyan. But the question Perry asks is, where is the money that Starr supposedly gave him for doping Bright Magic? Davis is left speechless.
Go on, read it, Mr. Davis. Very well, I'll read it for you. It's $5,108. Now, where's the other $5,000? That $5,000 can save your life, Mr. Davis. Can you produce it?
In the denouement, Tick's done with Gloria, and he gets to stand on Perry's veranda, which is one way of feeling 10, if not 100 feet tall. Now, let's get trivial, shall we? Each episode in our trivia section, I give you 3 takeaways. A Paul is a subject worth investigating more. Adela is something about a particular actor or actress in the episode, and a Perry is something we learn about our intrepid hero. Our Paul. I loved this little riff by Bob Allen on why getting to train a horse like Bright Magic is so special.
You know what a trainer has to do to get a horse like Bright Magic? Starts out a jip at the fairs. $200 claimers, lame, brittle, windbroken. Then you work yourself up. But you don't find a horse like Bright Magic. Oh, no. They don't even run at the half-milers. You have to sort of graduate. Move up to the mile tracks. Then to the Big Apple.
Big Apple?
Yeah, Saratoga, Belmont. You know, the equivalent of Santa Anita and Hollywood Park out here. And then you work and slave and pray and hope that you'll find a horse like Bright Magic. Even then, at 6 to an even, you'll never make it.
So our Paul prompt for this episode: how closely does Bob Allen's trajectory, as discussed in that clip, echo the plight of a normal horse trainer? This seems like a really specific speech. It doesn't really do anything to further the plot. I'm not sure whether it was in the original story by Robert Warnes Leach or in the teleplay that was co-written by Leach and C. Legg Lester. I really like it. I want to know, does this speech reflect a Hollywood view of what it would take to train a great horse, or is there truth in what Allen has to say? Our Della this week concerns Billy Pearson, Tick Barton himself.
Ah, this is a nice colt. That was an easy work.
And that's all hogwash about you losing your nerve, eh, Tick?
I just want to say a little bit of research showed me that Pearson probably deserves an entire episode, if not an entire podcast, to himself. He was the subject of a 2009, I believe, Vanity Fair profile that listed so many biographical details that were beyond belief and emphasized the fact that Pearson himself loved to tell tall tales, that the highlights I'm going to give you should probably be fact-checked, but this is what I could find, and there's a whole lot more out there. Some highlights. Pearson grew up in 1920s LA. He was the son of a single mother, and he had a grandfather who boasted that he was a gold prospector in California. Pearson never finished high school. The profile says he got kicked out. In 1941, Pearson really did fall off a horse and was trampled by 5 horses and spent nearly 6 months in a stretcher. Now, he recovered, and in the late 1940s, early 1950s, won 300 horse races for a combined total of $1.3 million. Cha-ching. Pearson got obsessed with pre-Columbian art and in fact was brought on to the television show $64,000 Question and the spin-off $64,000 Challenge and won $180,000 as an art expert. The cat was good friends with John Huston, Gene Kelly, Andy Williams, Vincent Price. There's a chapter in a recent John Huston biography specifically devoted to Huston's relationship with Pearson. The dude was married 6 times, and despite all the cash he'd won in horse racing and the $64,000 shows, he had $2.71 in his bank account in the late 1950s. Now, his stint on Perry Mason wasn't his first acting credit. He appeared uncredited in 2 roles and then had appeared in a television show in 1952, I believe. But he was the star in this particular Perry Mason episode. This was certainly his biggest acting role to that time. By the way, in the Vanity Fair piece, you know it can't all be taken for granted because they have a picture, a still from the television episode, and the caption underneath says that Pearson appears in a cameo. It's a little bit more than a cameo, I would say, if you're the defendant in the case. More intriguingly, or perhaps even more intriguingly, during that same year, he was cast as the lead in another TV series based on Earl Stanley Gardner's detective novels about Donald Lamb and Bertha Cool. These were novels that Gardner wrote under the pen name A. Fair. Now, the series didn't get picked up, but you can find the pilot on YouTube, and it's worth looking at for at least 5 minutes. It's not very good. You can see why it didn't get picked up. But inside the first 2 minutes, you get to see Earl Stanley Gardner, the man himself, inside Perry Mason's office, talking about how excited he is for this series. And then you also get, of course, Billy Pearson at various points making fun of his size. The cat died in 2002 at the age of 82. I'm telling you, you should check out the profile that Nat Moss wrote for Vanity Fair if you want to know more. Our Perry this episode involves our intrepid hero's reputation. Here is what Mrs. Banyan says about Perry.
Mason's a very dangerous man.
Dangerous?
Well, I mean, he can twist things around and make you seem to say things that you don't mean at all. I've heard a lot about him. He's a very clever man.
I have only one thing to say. Is Mrs. Banyan having cocktails with Mrs. Hamilton Berger? Because who would say that about Perry except a cop? It made her, frankly, a murder suspect for me just on general principle. It's a fascinating conundrum. How did these kinds of rumors about our hero get spread? Only guilty people think that way, Mrs. O'Banion. Everybody else knows Perry's a devoted servant of justice. The theme for this episode is freedom. When Gloria calls Tick up at the end of the episode, Tick declines the call. You see, he's free.
Like I told you, Mr. Mason, it's wonderful to be free.
Let us count the ways. He's free from jail. He's free from the ball and chain of marriage. He's free from employment. In Perry, two oft-repeated endings involve either a reunion for the defendant or a separation for the defendant. So on the reunion side, think of the Grangers in the case of the nervous accomplice, or think about the Harrisons in the case of the married moonlighter. On the separation side, you might think of Harriet Bain, who gets to throw out her murdering ex-fiancé, or in the case of the Curious Bride, Rhoda gets to ditch her murdering husband and chase after the doctor who's loved her the entire time. Here, Tick gets an opportunity to break away from his unfaithful wife without seeing her go to jail. Now, Janis Joplin sang, Chris Christopherson wrote, freedom's just another word for nothing left to lose, but if I were advising someone who's going to enter into a romantic relationship with Tick, I would simply say, if you have something left to lose, you should keep your freedom. Tick won't be opening any doors for you. Now it's time for a Perry proverb. Perry trusts his clients, and here he unleashes a logical axiom worth remembering.
I didn't think you could throw a race. How could I think you'd murder someone?
So, if you didn't commit lesser crime X, then you wouldn't commit greater crime Z. An inversion of that might work as well. What made Eddie Davis such a prime suspect is that A, he doped a horse, B, he blackmailed Mr. Banyan. Of course he's a prime suspect to have committed the murder, which is a greater crime. See if this inductive pattern holds throughout the rest of the series. Now, let's grab a swig from the water cooler.
Will you please describe the nature of this scopolamine drug to the court?
Well, it submerges certain inhibitory areas of the brain without affecting other functions.
Might it be used as sort of a truth serum?
Yes, definitely in some cases. It leaves the memory, hearing, and powers of speech unimpaired. However, it's not as dependable as sodium pentothal.
Our research prompt from the last episode involved car keys, namely the way in which Frank Kieran's 1950s Chrysler convertible, in the case of the married moonlighter, had separate keys for the trunk and ignition.
By any chance, did you try the ignition key?
Yes, I did.
Did it work?
No, it wouldn't turn.
But it did fit the lock.
Perfectly.
Myra Caraway, my aunt, did some research and she writes in, quote, I found a reference to the 1995 Honda that had different keys for the ignition and trunk. Some older cars had one key for the ignition and passenger doors and a different key for the trunk and glove compartment. Sometimes the ignition key had a square head and the trunk key had a round head. I've seen the round-headed keys for trunks, but I don't remember if it was for one of my cars or one of my parents' cars. Thanks so much, Aunt Mai. The history of car keys? That's a fun little internet deep dive. I don't know if last episode's prompt got you to do that, but it's worth checking out. And I'm just going to sum up 3 things I learned. First, Chrysler, the company that made the car that Frank Kieran is driving, was on the vanguard of car keys. Its 1949 cars were the first models to have a single key ignition system. Why don't you go and check out what it was like to churn on a car between, say, 1900 and 1948 before Chrysler came out with single key ignition. Second, I discovered the differences between pin tumbler locks and wafer tumbler locks. You can find quick illustrations or tutorials on that via YouTube. Now, why is this important? Because the keys for door locks, ignitions, and trunks on your Chrysler cars in this era were activated with pin tumbler locks, while the glove compartment had a wafer tumbler lock. So in all likelihood, if you had a lock on your glove compartment in this Chrysler car, you had 3 keys, because you had a trunk key, you had an ignition key, and then you would have needed a separate key for the wafer tumbler lock. And third, I couldn't find anything definitive about the advent of the single key that addressed car doors, ignition, trunk, and glove compartment. But key technology exploded in the 80s and 90s and led to the key fobs and Bluetooth phone-operated key systems we have now. As always, I'd love feedback about this particular episode or the podcast in general. Was there something about this episode you'd like to comment on or correct? You can leave comments on the pod's website at theperrypod.libsyn.com or email me at theperrypod@gmail.com. You'll find those links in the show notes. All PerryPod episodes are available via Spotify, YouTube, and iTunes. Thanks again for joining me on this pod journey. Join us next time as Perry and Hamilton Berger join a mutual appreciation society. Say it isn't so, Perry. It's the case of the Purple Woman. Join me, won't you? Until then, this is Jonathan Searcy saying, keep on walking that Park Avenue beat.